Okay, so what is PBR? Well, PBR stands for physically based rendering. There's also a secondary component known as PBS or physically based shading, but both refer to a method of shading and rendering that provides a accurate representation of how light interacts with surfaces. PBS usually is specifically for shading concepts and PBR is specifically for rendering and lighting. But both will actually describe how the process of representing assets are done from a physically accurate standpoint. And well, what does that mean? Well, one, it's going to make sure that we are using accurate measurements for the albedo color, as well as the reflectance values and microsurface for whatever material we're using. And two, that they will look physically accurate in all types of lighting conditions. So in PBR, there's going to be three different tenets to understand what is PBR. So energy conservation is a concept that states that an object cannot reflect more light than it receives. So what that means is that something that's very diffused and rough is going to reflect a very dim but a very wide type of highlight. Whereas something smoother and more reflective is going to reflect more brighter and tighter highlights. The understanding is that an object cannot basically generate its own light. So that's what we have to make sure of when we're creating these assets and we're trying to pinpoint the proper reflectance values if we're using gloss spec or metalness roughness, that we're not generating more light than the object is receiving. The second thing is a mathematical function known as BRDF. So BRDF stands for bidirectional reflectance distribution function. It's a big mouthful, but it describes the reflectance properties of a material surface. In computer graphics, we have a couple different types of models for BRDF. The most common usually are GGX or Blinn, but there is also a version that they use for Disney's animation films in Pixar and their other rendering studios that have been actually used in some video games, one of which is the Order 1886. Their PBR materials are a part of a system that reflects very similar to how Disney was handling their materials for Monsters University, but they've also have made sure to improve and work further on to try and get more accurate representations of materials. If you actually would look at how they're handling fur and other fabric materials in The Incredibles, it's actually very amazing how far they've come along. To simply put, in BRDF, each material that we are trying to measure out will have a different reflectance value than another, whether it's metals or non-metals, which leads us into our third point, which is dielectric and conductive materials. So in PBR, there's two different types of materials, dielectric and conductive. Dielectric materials are insulators. They absorb more than they reflect, or they also absorb electricity, whereas conductive, by its name, conducts electricity. Now, we've basically broken this down to anything that is either metal or non-metal, but there are certain non-metal materials that do conduct electricity. So examples of dielectric materials are glass, plastic, wood, ceramics, and leathers. And then conductive materials are steel, copper, gold, basically, in general, metals. We handle dielectric and metal materials in two different ways: gloss spec and metalness roughness workflows. The reason why engines like Unreal Engine use metalness roughness is, for one, it is more cost effective performance wise to use metalness roughness because it allows you to do channel packing. If you were using gloss spec, if you had to do anything with metals, you would have to use the color of the metal inside of the specular channel. Whereas metalness roughness, you can actually do that, but you can also get away with just putting the color in the albedo and just changing the value to just be black or white. For metalness roughness, if the metal channel is black, it means that it's not metal. If it is white, it means that it is a metal. You can do gray values as well for transitioning between non-metal materials like rust or dirt or something, but it is not recommended to just have a very sharp contrast between black to white because it would cause rendering issues between the transition of metal. In spec gloss, specularity runs exactly the same, but the difference is that for specular value, everything's going to have a minimum gray value, depending on what engine it is. There will never be a all black specular map, For the microsurface channel, for the metal and roughness, it would be the roughness channel. How it works is that if something is very smooth and shiny and reflective, it's black. And if it's very rough and not reflective at all, it's white. It's the reverse for gloss. The reason being is that it's a lot more understanding to reverse it so that it doesn't confuse an artist when they're trying to calculate gloss to spec. So gloss would run exactly the opposite. So if it's very glossy and shiny, it's white. And if it's not glossy or shiny, it's black. The reason why we have roughness, metalness in general is because it is cost effective. It is easier for artists to understand values. The only other channel you need to know about besides the microsurface and reflectivity values, with gloss spec and metalness roughness, is the albedo map. Albedo is a Latin word for white. It means that compared to original base color and diffuse maps, albedo does not have any light information in the color map. Back then, when people were doing things, if they really wanted to, they would throw in ambient occlusion. They'd throw in and paint their own shadows and their own highlights as well. Not in the way that, say, games like Blizzard handle theirs, since theirs is hand painted, but it doesn't give you a good amount of information when you have to handle in PBR, you have to handle shadows and highlights and everything else through actual rendering. If you don't, you're realizing that you already have shadows baked into the albedo and you're already adding in more shadows to it or more highlights to it. And that just kind of makes things either more blown out in white or more underexposed in black. You can, in some cases, use ambient occlusion, but it's not recommended. You can use ambient occlusion for things like, say, grass, because there is so much empty space that sometimes shadows and ambient occlusion can't be generated enough to fill in those gaps. So you can use a little bit of ambient occlusion there. You can use maybe a little bit if you want to on some dirt and stuff, but it's only for the very, very like micro details, nothing too big. Okay. The reason why we are working more with PBR texturing and not the previous ways we used to texture in older generations was that the old generation was more ad hoc. People would eyeball, specular values based off of how shiny a metal they think is, and they would never write down any of these values. So there was never any consistency on how people would author their materials. In a game, if you have 10 different environment artists, you're going to most likely have 10 different golds or 10 different irons or 10 different aluminums. The big problem also is that there will be 10 different aluminums or metals or whatever, and there's also going to be another set of those 10 different metals that are going to be used in a completely different lighting scenario, whether it's a daytime or a nighttime, sunset, interior, exterior. How they made these materials, there never was consistency on how they would look in different lighting models. So one of the biggest advances with PBR is that we author materials so that they can be used one time and have the same exact rendering capability in any different lighting scenario. So here I have Marmoset Toolbag 4 set up to show different types of the same material. Both are using gloss spec and roughness metalness. So this red one here is a dielectric plastic. This one is gloss spec. This one's roughness metalness. They're using completely different inputs, but they're generating the same exact material. So in gloss spec, how things are handled is using a gloss map for the microsurface, basically the shine and reflectance of a surface, if it's rough or if it's shiny, and then a specular map. So most dielectrics will use a default 0.04 or however it's handled inside of an engine. In this case, we just have it as 0.4 because that is the default how Marmoset handles these things. But every object will have a specular value, no matter what. Dielectrics will always usually have it as default, and then you would just handle the gloss. And then they would, in most studios, they would actually have written down what types of objects have a certain gloss value, whether it's plastic, wood, charcoal, whatever. And then you would have your albedo, which is your color map, but without any lighting information in it. There will be no highlights painted in, there will be no ambient occlusion, there will be no shadows. It's just the color. Because in PBR, all that information, the darkening and lightening of a material is handled in their shadows and their highlights. So in roughness metalness, it's very similar, but they have simplified it just a little bit. So roughness is handled the opposite of how gloss is. So in this case, roughness, if it's on the darker end of things, it is not rough at all. For lighter colors like white, it is very rough. It's the complete inverse because they didn't want to confuse artists whether something is gloss spec or roughness metalness. They just decided, hey, we're going to make this completely opposite so it doesn't confuse artists in the long run. For your reflectance value, it's handled in just one way, metalness. And in that case, it would be, is it metal or is it not metal? So if it's not metal, the value will be put to black. If it is metal, it will be put to white. There is a case where you can have gray in the metal map. It's usually for the transition of something that's metal to non-metal, like rust, patina, or even dirt. In that case, you would have a little bit of gray value because if you have no transition, if it's just black to white, the contrast is so strong that it causes rendering issues. In gloss spec, the metal is going to be very different. So the albedo is going to be colored black, and the color of the metal will be handled in the specular map. So here we have this brass material. It's already picked out in the specular value. Gloss is handled the exact same, but the albedo is black. The reason why we do this is because it's trying to mimic how scientifically metal gets its color. It's usually from its molecular structure. So what we do is we color it black because if we try to put white in, it adds white on top of the color as well. So you get this very blown out color. It doesn't look realistic at all. So we have it. So if there's a metal in there, your albedo will be black. If it's non-metal, it will have color in there, but keep it black if it's metal. We won't have to worry too much about this. This is just me trying to go over PBR as simply as I can. In Unreal Engine, it's handled roughness metalness. Roughness metalness was created in a way to make it easier for artists to understand PBR and to implement it better. Roughness metalness usually is more optimized and efficient because with reflectance values and surface values, it's usually black and white. We can channel pack it basically. And channel packing is basically the method of applying black and white or grayscale images in the color channels of a single texture. In Unreal Engine, when it first came out, they were channel packing using RMA or roughness in the red channel, metalness in the green channel, and ambient occlusion in the blue channel. At my studio, since our games, we do an ORM version, which means ambient occlusion in the red channel, roughness in the green channel, and metalness in the blue channel. We do that because some of our rendering engineers were able to figure out that the green channel doesn't have as much compression and actually has better quality for a grayscale map. So we do the roughness on there because that needs to be the most sharp as it can be. Metalness doesn't have to because it's a very broad value. Ambient occlusion doesn't have to be sharp. It's usually very blurry anyways. You don't want to have sharp details of ambient occlusion because it looks very odd and renders weird. So we keep those in the other channels. There are other cases in other studios where they handle channel packing in a different way. Studios such as EA in their Frostbite engine, how they handle things, they have null map channel packing. So in the red and the green channel, they have the first two channels of a null map, but in the third channel, they put the height map in because they will generate their third channel information either from in-engine or they will also derive it from the height map. Here I have on screen a very simple and easy tool if you want to do channel packing. If you don't, say, have a Photoshop license, this is for free. This is by Matthias Dahlia. It's a very simple tool. All you have to do is just apply your textures, drag and drop them in the red, green, and blue channels, or if you're also using an alpha as well, it will channel pack it together and then export it out for you. You can also even take in a channel pack texture already and bring it in there, and it will unpack it and export it as separate color maps. If you want to, you can also unpack a channel pack texture as well and break it down to its three grayscale maps.